There was a boy who grew up in a part of Detroit that most people only saw on the news. A kind of neighborhood where streetlights flickered more than they worked, where sirens sang louder than birds, and where dreams were something you kept to yourself, because saying them out loud felt like asking for disappointment. His name was Terrence. 14 years old, quiet, the kind of kid teachers forgot to call on and classmates barely noticed in the hallways. He lived in a small apartment on the 3rd floor of a building that always smelled like cooking grease and old carpet. The radiator clanked so loud in winter that his grandmother joked it was trying to have a conversation. His mother worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3. She left before the sun came up and came home after it went down. Most nights, Terrence only saw her as a shape moving through the dark kitchen, putting leftovers in the fridge, kissing his forehead while he pretended to be asleep. His grandmother raised him, a woman with hands rough from decades of work, but soft when they touched his face. She believed in God, in hard work, and in her grandson. Even when he gave her no particular reason to believe he was special, she looked at him like he was made of gold. Terrence had never owned anything expensive. His shoes came from the discount bin. His clothes were hand-me-downs from a cousin 2 sizes bigger. The most valuable thing in the apartment was a television that sometimes needed a smack on the side to stop the picture from rolling. But none of that mattered to him. Because Terrence had a secret dot, it started when he was 11. His grandmother used to take him to St. Augustine's Church every Sunday. Not the big fancy church uptown with the stained glass windows and the organ that shook the floor. This was a small brick building on a corner, with water stains on the ceiling and pews that creaked when you sat down. But in the back corner of that church, pushed against the wall like it had been forgotten, sat an old upright piano, most Sundays. After the service ended and his grandmother stayed behind to talk with the other women, Terrence would wander over to that piano. At first, he just looked at it, ran his fingers along the wood, pressed a single key, and listened to the sound fade into the empty room. Then one day, he pressed another key, and another, and something happened inside him that he could not explain. It was like a door opened, not in the church, but in his chest, in his mind, in some part of him he did not even know existed. The sounds coming from that old piano were not just sounds. They were feelings. They were colors. They were everything he had never been able to say out loud. From that day on, Terrence lived for Sundays. He would rush through the service, barely hearing the sermon, counting the minutes until he could slip away to that corner. The church let him stay. The pastor, a kind man with gray hair and tired eyes, noticed the boy and said nothing, just smiled and left the back door unlocked a little longer. But Sundays were not enough. Terrence started coming after school. He would take the long way home, stopping at the church for an hour, sometimes 2. He had no teacher, no sheet music, no one to tell him if he was doing it right or wrong. What he had was a phone, a cracked, second-hand phone his mother had given him for emergencies. And on that phone, he discovered a world he never knew existed. Videos of people playing piano, tutorials that showed fingers moving across keys, recordings of music so beautiful it made his eyes sting. He watched them over and over, memorizing the movements, then running to the church to try them himself. It was slow at first, painful. His fingers would not do what his brain told them to do. He hit wrong notes so often that he wanted to quit 100 times. But every time he thought about giving up, he would hear a piece of music in his head, and his hands would find their way back to the keys. Weeks turned into months. Months turned into years. By the time Terrence was 14, something had changed. He did not just play the piano anymore. He spoke through it. All the things he could never say, all the feelings he kept locked inside, all the loneliness of being invisible in a world that never stopped moving. It all came out through his fingers. His grandmother noticed first. She came to pick him up from church one evening and found him playing with his eyes closed, his body swaying, lost in the music. She stood in the doorway and cried without making a sound. When he finished, she walked over and put her hand on his shoulder. "Baby," she said, her voice shaking, "where did you learn to do that?" Terence did not have an answer. He just shrugged and said, "I just kept trying, Grandma." She looked at him for a long time. Then she said something he would never forget. "God gave you something, Terence. Something special. And you have to share it. You hear me? You cannot keep this to yourself." He did not know what she meant. Not then. But a few weeks later, she showed him a flyer she had found at the community center. The Detroit Youth Orchestra was holding open auditions. It was a big program, the kind that sent kids to music schools and got them scholarships and opened doors that stayed locked for people like them. The auditions were across town, in a building Terence had never been to, in a world he had never touched. His first instinct was to say no. He was not like those kids. The ones with private teachers and fancy instruments and parents who drove them to lessons in nice cars. He was just a boy from a forgotten neighborhood who taught himself to play on a church piano with a cracked phone and a stubborn heart, but his grandmother would not let it go. "You have to try," she said. "You have to let them hear you. What if they laugh at me?" He asked. She took his face in her hands, those rough, soft hands that had held him his whole life. "Then they laugh," she said. "But at least you will know. At least you will not spend the rest of your life wondering what could have happened if you had been brave enough to walk through that door." Terence looked at the flyer. The audition was in 2 weeks. He had no suit, no experience, no idea what to expect, but for the first time in his life, he had something else. He had hope. And so on a cold Saturday morning, Terence put on the cleanest clothes he owned, and his grandmother put on her best dress, and together they took 3 buses across the city to a building with marble floors and tall windows and people who looked like they belonged in a different world. When they walked through the front door, every head in the lobby turned to look at them, and Terence knew in that moment that everything was about to change. He just did not know how much. The lobby was bigger than his entire apartment building. Terence stood just inside the doorway, afraid to move, afraid to breathe too loud. The floor was made of marble, so polished he could see his own reflection looking back at him. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling. The walls were covered with framed photographs of famous musicians, their eyes staring down like judges. And everywhere he looked, there were children, but not children like him. These kids wore suits that fit perfectly, dresses with price tags his mother earned in a month. They carried instrument cases made of leather and velvet. Their parents stood beside them, checking phones, adjusting collars, speaking in low, confident voices about teachers and competitions and summer programs in cities Terence had only seen in movies. He looked down at his own clothes. His button-up shirt was wrinkled from the bus ride. His pants were a little too short. His shoes had a scuff on the left toe that he had tried to hide with a marker that morning. His grandmother squeezed his hand. "Stand up straight," she whispered. "You belong here just as much as any of them." He wanted to believe her. He really did. They walked to the registration table where a woman with glasses and a clipboard looked them over with a quick measuring glance. "Name?" she asked. "Terence Williams," his grandmother answered. "He is here for the piano audition." The woman flipped through her papers. "I do not see a registration." "We did not know he had to register early," his grandmother said. "The flyer said open auditions." The woman sighed like this was a problem she did not have time for. "Wait here?" She disappeared through a side door. Terence felt the eyes of the room on him. A boy about his age, holding a violin case that probably cost more than a car, whispered something to his mother. She glanced at Terence and quickly looked away. He had never felt so small in his life. A few minutes later, the woman returned. Behind her walked a man who changed the temperature of the entire room just by entering it. He was tall. Silver hair swept back from his forehead. He wore a dark suit with a pocket square, folded in perfect triangles. His shoes clicked on the marble floor with every step. Everything about him said money, power, and a lifetime of being obeyed. This was Mr. Holloway, the director of the Detroit Youth Orchestra, a man who had trained at the finest music schools in the country, a man who had spent 30 years deciding which young musicians deserved a future and which ones did not. He looked at Terence the way someone looks at a stain on an expensive carpet. "So," he said, his voice smooth and cold, "you are the walk-in." Terence nodded. His throat felt like it was filled with sand. Mr. Holloway glanced at the clipboard. No formal training. No registered instructor. No competition history. He looked up. "And you want to audition for my orchestra?" "Yes, sir," Terence managed. "On what instrument?" "Piano, sir." Something flickered in Mr. Holloway's eyes. Not interest, amusement. "Piano," he repeated slowly, like the word itself was a joke. He turned to face the crowded lobby, raising his voice just enough for everyone to hear. "Ladies and gentlemen, it seems we have a young man here who taught himself piano and believes he is ready to compete with students from the finest academies in the Midwest." A ripple of laughter moved through the room. Not loud, not cruel, but loud enough, cruel enough. Terence's face burned. He wanted to disappear. He wanted to grab his grandmother's hand and run back to the bus stop and never think about this day again. But his grandmother did not move. She stood beside him like a wall. "He just wants a chance to play," she said quietly. Mr. Holloway tilted his head like he was studying something curious. "A chance," he repeated. "Do you know how many children in this room have been training since they were 5 years old? Do you know how much their families have sacrificed? Lessons, instruments, travel, competitions. And you walk in off the street with no training and ask for a chance?" His grandmother's voice did not waver. "That is exactly what I am asking." The lobby had gone completely silent. Every eye was on them now. Parents, children, staff, everyone watching to see what would happen next. Mr. Holloway smiled. It was not a kind smile. "All right," he said. "I will make you a deal." He stepped closer, looking down at Terence like a cat watching a mouse. "I am not going to waste the judge's time with someone who clearly does not belong here. But I will give you 5 minutes in the practice room. Just you and a piano. Play something, anything. And if you can play anything, anything at all, that belongs in this audition." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "I will get on my knees. Right here in this lobby. In front of everyone." More laughter. Louder this time. A woman in pearls covered her mouth. A man in an expensive coat shook. His head like this was the most entertaining thing he had seen all week. Mr. Holloway spread his hands. "But when you fail, and you will fail, you will leave quietly and never waste my time again. Do we have a deal?" Terence's heart pounded so hard he could feel it in his ears. His hands were shaking. Every voice in his head screamed at him to say no, to walk away, to accept that this world was not made for people like him. But then he felt his grandmother's hand on his. Back, steady, warm, believing in him even when he could not believe in himself. He thought about all those hours in the church, the cracked phone screen, the wrong notes and the frustration and the nights he wanted to quit. He thought about every single moment that had led him here, to this lobby, To this man who was so sure he would fail, and something shifted inside him. "Yes, sir," he said. His voice was quiet, but it did not shake. "We have a deal." Mr. Holloway blinked. For just a second, something crossed his face. Surprise, maybe, or confusion. He had expected the boy to crumble. They always did, but he recovered quickly, the smooth mask sliding back into place. "Very well," he said. He gestured to an assistant. "Take him to practice room 3. 5 minutes. Not a second more." The assistant, a young woman with a tight smile, motioned for Terence to follow. His grandmother grabbed his arm before he could go. "Terence," she said softly, so only he could hear, "you do not have to prove anything to that man. You do not have to prove anything to anyone in this room. You just have to play. The way you play in that church when you think nobody is listening. You hear me?" He nodded. "Double quotes, go show them," she said. "Show them what God put inside you." He turned and followed the assistant down a long hallway. The sounds of the lobby faded behind him. His footsteps echoed on the hard floor. His heart beat like a drum dot. The assistant stopped at a door marked with a small brass number 3. 5 minutes, she said, and her voice had a trace of pity in it. Like she already felt sorry for him. She opened the door, and there, sitting in the middle of the small room under cold white lights, was the most beautiful piano Terence had ever seen. A Steinway Grand, black and gleaming. The kind of instrument he had only ever seen in videos. The kind of instrument that cost more than his grandmother would earn in 10 years. He walked toward it slowly. Like approaching something holy. The assistant closed the door behind him. And suddenly, it was just Terence and the piano. 5 minutes to change everything. Or 5 minutes to prove Mr. Holloway right. He sat down on the bench, placed his fingers above the keys, closed his eyes, and in the silence of that room, he made a choice. He was not going to play for Mr. Holloway. He was not going to play for the laughing parents, or the whispering children, or anyone else in that building. He was going to play for his grandmother, for his mother who worked 3 jobs, for every person who had ever been told they did not belong. He was going to play for himself. He took a breath, and then he began. The first note was soft, almost a whisper. Terence let it hang in the air for a moment, feeling the vibration travel through his fingertips, up his arms, into his chest. The piano was unlike anything he had ever touched. The keys responded to the slightest pressure. The sound was rich and full, filling the small practice room like warm water filling a glass. For a second, he almost lost his nerve. This was not his church piano, with its sticky keys and faded wood. This was a Steinway, an instrument built for concert halls and master musicians, an instrument that seemed to demand perfection. But then he closed his eyes, and something strange happened. The room disappeared. The cold lights above him faded. The polished floor and the white walls and the brass number on the door all melted away until there was nothing left but the music. He was back in St. Augustine's alone. The evening light coming through the dusty windows. The smell of old wood and candle wax. The feeling of safety that he only ever found in that corner of the church, where nobody watched and nobody judged. And he began to play for real. He had chosen a piece by Chopin, a ballade, one of the hardest pieces ever written for piano. He had spent almost a year learning it, note by note, measure by measure, using videos and recordings and endless trial and error. His fingers had cramped. His eyes had burned from staring at the small phone screen. There were nights he played the same passage 50 times and still could not get it right, but he never gave up. Because every time he heard that piece played by a master, something inside him broke open. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever heard. It told a story without words. It held pain and hope and longing and triumph all at once. And now, in this small room with 5 minutes on the clock, he played it like his life depended on it. The notes came slowly at first, a gentle melody that floated through the air like a question being asked. Then the music began to build, layers upon layers. His left hand moved in patterns so complex they seemed impossible. His right hand sang a melody so pure could make you forget how to breathe. Outside the practice room, something was happening. The hallway was supposed to be quiet. The other children were in separate rooms, warming up for their auditions. The parents were back in the lobby, checking their phones, making small talk, trying not to look nervous. But the walls of practice room 3 were not as thick as they seemed. A woman walking past stopped mid-step. She tilted her head, listening. Then she took a step closer to the door. A boy carrying a cello case paused at the end of the hallway. He set down his case and stood there, frozen. One by one, people began to drift toward the sound. They gathered in the hallway, silent, drawn by something they could not explain. Parents who had been laughing at Terence minutes ago now stood with their mouths slightly open. Children who had whispered about his clothes now listened with wide eyes. The assistant who had shown him to the room came back to check on him. She was supposed to knock on the door and tell him his 5 minutes were almost up. Instead, she stood outside with her hand raised, unable to move. Inside the room, Terence knew nothing of this. He was lost in the music, completely and utterly lost. His fingers flew across the keys. The piece grew darker, more intense. There was a passage in the middle that sounded like a storm rolling across the ocean. His hands moved so fast they were almost a blur. The piano thundered and crashed, filling the room with waves of sound that seemed too big for such a small space. Then, just when it seemed like the storm would never end, everything shifted. The music softened. The chaos melted into something tender. A melody emerged from the noise like the sun breaking through clouds after a hurricane. It was the same melody from the beginning, but different now. Sadder, wiser, like someone who had been through the fire and come out the other side. Terence thought about his mother. The way she looked when she came home at midnight, too tired to eat, but still smiling when she saw him. He thought about his grandmother, who had never stopped believing in him, even when he had nothing to show for it. He thought about every cold night in that church, every hour of practice, every moment he had doubted himself, and he poured all of it into the keys. Back in the lobby, Mr. Holloway was speaking with one of the judges when he noticed something strange. The room had gone quiet, too quiet. He looked around and realized that half the people who had been there were gone. He frowned. Where is everyone? Someone pointed toward the hallway. He walked toward the sound, his expensive shoes clicking on the marble floor. As he got closer, he could hear it. The music. Faint at first, then louder with every step. He turned the corner and stopped. The hallway was packed. Parents, children, staff members, all standing shoulder to shoulder, facing the door of practice room 3. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. They just listened. Mr. Holloway pushed his way through the crowd. His face was set, annoyed. This was supposed to be a quick embarrassment. The boy was supposed to stumble through something simple, prove himself unworthy, and leave. That was how these things always went. But when he reached the front of the crowd and heard the music clearly for the first time, his face changed. The annoyance faded. The arrogance melted. For a moment, he did not look like the powerful director of a prestigious orchestra. He looked like a man who had just seen something he thought was impossible. Inside the room, Terence was approaching the end of the piece. The music built one final time. A cascade of notes that climbed higher and higher, reaching for something just out of grasp. His hands stretched across the keys in patterns that should have been too difficult for someone his age. for someone with no training, for someone who had learned everything from a cracked phone screen in an empty church, but he played them perfectly. Final passage was like a prayer, soft, gentle, full of a quiet kind of hope that hurt to listen to. Each note hung in the air for just a moment before fading, making room for the next dot, and then came the last chord. Terence pressed the keys and held them. The sound filled the room, rich and deep and full of everything he had never been able to say. It rang out through the door into the hallway, washing over the silent crowd like a wave dot. Then slowly it faded, and then there was nothing. Terence sat at the piano, his hands still resting on the keys, his eyes still closed. His heart was pounding. His fingers ached. He had never played like that before. He had never felt anything like that before. He did not know what was happening outside the door. He did not know that 40 people stood in silence, some of them crying, all of them stunned. He did not know that the assistant had tears running down her cheeks. He did not know that children who had mocked him were now staring at the door like they had just witnessed a miracle. And he did not know that Mr. Holloway, the man who had promised to kneel if the boy could play, was standing at the front of the crowd with a look on his face that nobody had ever seen before. It was the look of a man who had just been proven completely, utterly, magnificently wrong. Terence opened his eyes. He lifted his hands from the keys, and slowly he turned toward the door. For a moment, everything was still. Then the door opened, and he saw them, all of them, packed into the hallway, staring at him like he was something they could not understand. His grandmother was there, too. Someone had brought her from the lobby. She stood in the middle of the crowd, her hand pressed to her heart, tears streaming down her face. But Terence was not looking at her. He was looking at Mr. Holloway. The director stood at the front of the crowd. His face was pale. His hands hung at his sides. The arrogance that had defined him just minutes ago was gone, stripped away by something he had not expected and could not deny. For a long moment, nobody moved, and Mr. Holloway did something that nobody in that hallway would ever forget. The hallway held its breath. 40 people stood frozen in place, waiting for something they could not name. The echo of the final chord still seemed to hang in the air, fading slowly like smoke from a candle. Terence sat at the piano bench, his hands trembling slightly in his lap. He looked at Mr. Holloway. The director looked back at him. And in that silence, something passed between them that words could never capture. Mr. Holloway's face was unreadable. The mask he had worn for 30 years, the armor of confidence and superiority, had cracked. Behind it was something raw, something human, something that looked almost like pain. He took a step forward, then another. The crowd parted for him like water around a stone. Nobody spoke. Nobody even seemed to breathe. He stopped at the doorway of the practice room, just a few feet from where Terence sat. For a long moment, he simply stood there, looking at this boy who had walked in off the street with nothing but a dream and a grandmother who believed in him. Then, slowly, deliberately, Mr. Holloway lowered himself to one knee. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Someone whispered something in disbelief. A woman covered her mouth with her hand, but Mr. Holloway was not finished. He lowered his other knee. Both knees now, right there on the cold floor of the hallway. In front of everyone who had laughed at his joke. In front of everyone who had expected the boy to fail. The most powerful man in the Detroit music world was kneeling before a 14-year-old kid from the wrong side of town. Nobody moved. Nobody knew what to do. Then Mr. Holloway spoke. His voice was quiet, stripped of its earlier coldness, stripped of everything but honesty. "I gave my word," he said, "and I am a man who keeps his word." He paused, and when he continued, his voice cracked just slightly. But this is not just about a promise. This is about something I almost did. Something unforgivable. He looked up at Terence. Their eyes met. I almost sent you away. I looked at your clothes and your shoes and where you came from, and I decided you were not worth my time. I decided you did not belong here. And I was wrong. I was so completely wrong. Terence did not know what to say. His throat was tight. His eyes were burning. He had dreamed of proving people wrong, of showing them what he could do. But he had never imagined anything like this. Mr. Holloway shook his head slowly. I have been doing this for 30 years. 30 years of auditions, of young musicians, of talent in every shape and size. And I have never, not once, heard anyone play like that. Not at your age. Not with your background. Not ever. He took a breath. What you just did in that room was not just playing. It was something else entirely. It was pure. It was honest. It was the reason music exists in the first place. He paused again, struggling with words that did not come easily to a man like him. I owe you an apology. A real one. Not for losing a silly bet, but for almost letting my own blindness rob the world of something extraordinary. The hallway was completely silent. People were crying openly now. Parents who had laughed. Children who had whispered. Even the assistant who had shown Terence to the room had tears running down her face. Terence's grandmother pushed through the crowd. Her face was wet with tears, but she was smiling. The kind of smile that comes from somewhere deep, from a place where hope lives even when everything seems impossible. She walked to her grandson and put her hands on his shoulders. I told you, she whispered. I told you God put something special inside you. Terence finally let himself breathe. A tear slipped down his cheek. Then another. He had held everything inside for so long. The loneliness, the doubt, the fear that maybe he was fooling himself, that maybe he was just a kid with a silly dream that would never go anywhere. But now, looking at his grandmother's face, looking at the man kneeling on the floor, looking at all these people who had doubted him and were now staring at him like he had just performed a miracle, he understood something. He understood that his grandmother had been right all along. Mr. Holloway rose slowly to his feet. His knees were stiff, and there was a moment of awkwardness as he steadied himself. A man his age was not used to kneeling on hard floors. But he did not seem embarrassed. He seemed lighter somehow, like putting down a weight he had been carrying for a very long time. He stepped into the practice room and stood before Terence. What is your name? He asked. His voice was different now, softer, almost gentle. Terence, sir. Mr. Holloway nodded. Terence, I want you to listen to me very carefully. What you have is rare. It is not something that can be taught. It is not something that comes from lessons or money or the right connections. It is a gift. And I have spent my entire career looking for exactly this. He glanced at Terence's grandmother, then back at the boy. I am not just going to let you audition. I am going to personally make sure that every door that should be open to you will be open. Scholarships, training, opportunities, everything. Because talent, like yours, does not come along very often. And when it does, it is the responsibility of people like me to make sure it is not wasted. Terence blinked. He was not sure he understood what was happening. You mean I can audition? He asked. Mr. Holloway almost smiled. You just did audition. And you passed. You did more than pass. You reminded everyone in this building why we do what we do. He turned to face the crowd still gathered in the hallway. This young man will be performing in the formal audition this afternoon. And I expect every one of you to be there. Not to judge, but to witness something special. The crowd began to murmur. People nodded. Someone started clapping. Then another person joined, and another, until the entire hallway filled with applause. Terence stood up from the bench. His legs felt weak. His head was spinning. This morning he had been a nobody. A kid from a forgotten neighborhood who taught himself piano on a broken-down church instrument. And now he was standing in a room full of people clapping for him, being promised things he had never dared to dream about. His grandmother pulled him into a hug. He buried his face in her shoulder the way he used to when he was small, and the world felt too big and too scary. "You did it, baby," she whispered. "You did it." But even as the applause continued, even as people came forward to shake his hand and tell him how amazing he was, Terence felt something else underneath the joy. He felt the weight of what came next, because this was just the beginning. The formal audition was still ahead. The judges would be watching. The other students, the ones with years of training and expensive teachers, would be watching too. Everyone would be waiting to see if what happened in that practice room was real or just a fluke. Mr. Holloway seemed to read his thoughts. He leaned close and spoke quietly, so only Terence could hear. "Do not let the pressure change you. Do not try to impress anyone. Just play the way you played today. Play like you are back in that church with nobody watching. That is where your power comes from. Never forget that." Terence nodded. The director straightened up and addressed the crowd again. "The formal auditions will resume in 1 hour. I suggest everyone take a moment to collect themselves. What we just witnessed is not something you see every day." People began to drift away, still talking in hushed voices, still glancing back at Terence like they were not quite sure he was real. His grandmother took his hand and led him to a quiet corner of the hallway. "How do you feel?" she asked. Terence thought about it. "Scared," he admitted. "Happy. Confused. I do not know. Everything at once." She smiled and squeezed his hand. "That is exactly how you should feel. That is what it feels like when your life is about to change." She looked at him with those eyes that had seen so much, that had watched him grow from a quiet little boy into someone capable of bringing a room full of strangers to tears. "One more time," she said. "One more time on that stage. And then the world will know what I have always known." Terence nodded. "One more time." He could do that. He had to. The auditorium was nothing like the practice room. 300 seats stretched out in curved rows, climbing upward toward the back like a wave frozen in place. The ceiling was high and decorated with patterns that looked like they belonged in a museum. Heavy red curtains hung on either side of the stage. And in the center, under a single spotlight, sat a grand piano even more beautiful than the one Terence had played earlier. He stood backstage, peeking through a gap in the curtain. His stomach was doing flips. His hands were cold and slightly damp. Every few seconds, he wiped them on his pants, but it did not seem to help. The other students had already performed. One by one, they had walked across that stage, sat down at that piano, and played pieces they had been practicing for years. They were good, really good. Their fingers moved with precision. Their posture was perfect. Their parents sat in the audience, nodding with approval. Now it was his turn. A woman with a headset touched his shoulder. "You are up next. 2 minutes." Terence nodded, but could not speak. His throat felt like it was closing. He looked out at the audience again. The seats were almost full. Word had spread about what happened in the practice room. People who had not planned to stay for the auditions were now sitting in the back rows, curious to see the boy everyone was talking about. And in the front row, right in the center, sat his grandmother. She was wearing the same dress she had worn this morning. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her eyes were fixed on the stage. Waiting. Next to her sat Mr. Holloway. The director had not left her side since the incident in the hallway. He had personally escorted her to the best seat in the house. Now he sat beside her, his face calm but watchful. The woman with the headset spoke again. "Okay, you are on. Good luck." Terence took a deep breath. Then another. He thought about what Mr. Holloway had told him. Do not try to impress anyone. Just play like you are back in that church with nobody watching. He stepped out from behind the curtain. The spotlight hit him immediately, warm and bright. For a moment, he could not see anything except white light. Then his eyes adjusted, and he saw them. All of them. Hundreds of faces staring up at him, waiting. He walked to the piano. His footsteps echoed in the silence. The bench was already pulled out, waiting for him. He sat down and adjusted his position. The keys stretched out before him, black and white, perfectly still. He placed his hands above them, and then something happened. All the fear drained out of him. The nervousness, the doubt, the pressure of all those watching eyes. It all just disappeared. Like someone had reached into his chest and lifted it away. He was not in an auditorium anymore. He was in St. Augustine's Church. The evening light was coming through the dusty windows. The old wooden pews were empty. The smell of candle wax hung in the air. And he was alone with the piano, the way he'd been 1,000 times before. He began to play. This time, he chose something different. Not the Chopin piece from before. Something else. A piece he had found on his phone late one night when he could not sleep. A piece by a composer named Debussy. It was called Clair de Lune, which meant moonlight in French. The first notes floated out into the auditorium like drops of light falling through darkness, soft, gentle, so quiet that people leaned forward in their seats just to hear. The melody unfolded slowly, like a flower opening in the morning. It was simple at first, just a few notes repeating, rising and falling like breath. But underneath, his left hand moved in patterns that added depth and color, turning something simple into something magical. People in the audience stopped fidgeting. Phones that had been glowing in the darkness went dark. Even the children who had been restless sat perfectly still. Terence played with his eyes closed. He did not need to see the keys. He knew them by feel, by instinct, by 3 years of teaching himself in an empty church. His fingers moved on their own, guided by something deeper than thought. The piece grew richer, fuller. The melody climbed higher, reaching for something beautiful and sad at the same time. There was longing in it. There was hope. There was the feeling of looking up at the moon on a quiet night, and feeling small but somehow connected to everything. In the front row, Terence's grandmother was crying silently. Tears ran down her cheeks, but she did not wipe them away. She just sat there, watching her grandson, her heart so full it hurt. Mr. Holloway sat beside her with his hands gripped tightly together. His face was still, but his eyes were shining. He had spent his whole life around music. He had heard the greatest pianists in the world perform on the greatest stages. But something about this boy, this moment, this pure and honest sound, touched him in a way he had not been touched in decades. The piece reached its climax. A passage of breathtaking beauty, the notes cascading like water over stones, filling the auditorium with sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Then, slowly, gently, it began to fade. The final notes were barely whispers. Terence held each one as long as he could, letting them hang in the air before releasing the next. The melody dissolved into silence, like moonlight fading at dawn. He lifted his hands from the keys. For a moment, there was nothing. Complete silence. The kind of silence that is not empty, but full. Full of everything that had just happened, everything that had been felt, everything that words could never capture. Then someone stood up. It was a woman in the middle section. She rose to her feet and began to clap. Then the man next to her stood. Then a child in the front row. Then another person, and another, until the entire auditorium was on its feet. The applause was not polite. It was not the kind of clapping you do because you are supposed to. It was thunderous. It was overwhelming. It shook the walls and filled the air and went on until Terence thought it would never stop. He stood up from the bench, not sure what to do. He had never received a standing ovation before. He had never received any ovation at all. He looked out at the crowd, at all those faces looking back at him with wonder and joy, and he felt something break open inside him. He looked at his grandmother. She was standing with everyone else, clapping with her hands raised high, her face wet with tears, but glowing with pride. He had done it. He had really done it. After the audition, everything moved fast. Mr. Holloway pulled him aside and told him he was not just accepted into the summer program. He was being offered a full scholarship. Every lesson, every expense, every opportunity would be covered. On top of that, Mr. Holloway personally wrote letters to 3 of the best music schools in the country, recommending Terence for their youth programs. Reporters came. They wanted to tell his story. The boy from the forgotten neighborhood who taught himself piano in a church. The boy who was mocked and then made a director kneel. It was the kind of story people needed to hear. 2 years later, at 16 years old, Terence performed at one of the most famous concert halls in America. The same hall where the greatest musicians in history had played. His name was on the program. His picture was in the lobby. And when he walked onto that stage, he wore a suit that fit perfectly, bought with money he had earned himself. But before he sat down at the piano, he looked into the audience. His grandmother was there, front row, wearing the same dress she had worn to that first audition. Because some things, Terence had told her, should never change. She smiled at him. He smiled back, and then he played. Later, when journalists asked what he remembered most about his journey, Terence always gave the same answer. "A man got on his knees for me once," he would say. "Not because I forced him, not because he had to, but because the music did something to him that he could not explain. That is when I understood what this gift was really for. Not for fame, not for money, but to make people feel something true, even when they do not want to." He would pause then, thinking about his grandmother, about the church, about all those hours alone with a cracked phone and a dream. Everyone has something inside them, he would say. Something the world needs. The hard part is being brave enough to share it, and finding the people who believe in you before anyone else does. He always ended with a smile. I was lucky. I found mine.